Thank y'all for coming. Our speaker tonight, Joseph Dunn, is going to speak on the politics of language. I originally threw a title at him and said, let's do Fighting for French in Louisiana, because we've got a tradition of nurturing French in Louisiana, South Louisiana, but it extends also to North Louisiana. For example, we started a bilingual school for children, and in North Louisiana we don't have French, but the state would only fund French and not Spanish. So for some reason, well, not for some reason, we know why, Louisiana was a colony. Joseph has been involved in the tourism business as well as many other things. So much, I'm not going to read it all, but he's quite experienced in dealing with language and dealing with the practical aspect of language. We're on the academic side and the teaching side. He's in the practical side, hands-on side. And I'm eager to listen to his speech. Without further ado, Joseph, you had
Thank you all very much for being here this evening and for having me. Thanks so much for inviting me. I will give you a couple of disclaimers before I start. I am not an academic. I am a communications, public relations, tourism, culture guy. And I look very specifically at language as a tool to sell things and sell tourism products and sell experiences and things like that. So I'm very in tune to words and expressions and how we use language politically and economically. And before I get started, I would like to ask you, how many of you were born, grew up, and were educated in the United States? So just about everybody, all right? So the way that we learn the history of this country and the way that we learn all of these narratives is presented to us through a very specific English-speaking, manifest destiny, westward expansion, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant perspective, all right? Louisiana was a French colony. Texas was a Spanish colony. And one of the things that I began to really understand and realize as I started looking in the work that I do at a historic sugar plantation, which was owned by Louisiana Creoles, lived in by these French-speaking families up until 1984, when you start digging into the literature, into the writings, and into these ideas about identity of who those people were, they were not American. And they did not see themselves as American, because they had been in Louisiana since 1699. And so through this presentation this evening, I'm going to talk to you about, in Louisiana, how identity has been deconstructed, replaced with American identity, and how through working with French and even the Creole languages, we're trying to take some of that back and shift some of these narratives. And this is not only really going to apply to French in Louisiana, it can also apply to heritage languages anywhere else. Spanish, where it was spoken historically, even where I am in Louisiana. Some of the things that I will say to you conflict with the canon about what everybody thinks about what was going on in Louisiana historically and what is happening there now with our efforts for French. And some of the things that I say are controversial. However, once again, if we rewind the clock and we look at the things that French speakers in Louisiana were writing and were saying and were presenting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, trying to protect the French language, none of this stuff that I say is new. People in Louisiana knew all of this stuff a century ago, but Americanization and English have made us forget them. All right? So let's go ahead and get started. There are all these perspectives that we have about the places that we live, and those perspectives are going to be projected by language, because language influences identity. It is going to influence our relationship to ourselves, to others, to the places that we live, and also to history. Whoever controls the language controls the politics and the economy of the space. This is not something that we often think about within the context of the United States, because we live in a majority language space. English dominates, and we don't have in the United States the idea of language as a criterion for minority status, nor do we have the idea of minority language rights. Because we live in this space where English is the de facto dominant language, even though there is not a de jure official language of the United States, right? So let's listen to what Eva Longoria, since we're in Texas, has to say.
Now, I'm 9th generation American. My family never crossed a border. The border crossed us.
That makes good sense, right? And that border crossed us in Louisiana in 1803. It crossed to Texas, and I forget what year because I know Louisiana history, not Texas history, but anyway, moving on.
Now,
but this is a diagram of the complexity of the French and Creole speaking populations in Louisiana. And if you would like for me to give you a bibliography of where I took all of this information to create a document for it, I can certainly send that to you later. But typically, generally speaking, when we think about the French language in Louisiana, we think about one population. Who's that? Come forward in time a little bit. Cajuns. We think about Cajuns. That word is ubiquitous, and it is absolutely associated with Louisiana. But that word did not really become associated with Louisiana until about 40 years ago. Before that, the word was Creole, right? And over time, what has happened with heritage language loss and with Americanization and reprogramming in English to think about the baseline for identity being skin color and not language, our relationship to that term Creole has shifted to a racialized idea. Until the 1960s, if you go back and you look at a tourism guidebook, or if you look at tourism souvenirs up until the 1960s, you will see the logo, Louisiana, the Creole state. Now, if Creole were associated with blackness during that time period, then that tourism slogan would never ever have been used in the geographic segregated American South. All right? So we're looking right now at a shift in how words are used based on politics. Okay? Historically, you have in the 18th century Native Americans, French Canadians, people from Germany, people from Switzerland, eventually the Acadians. There are Africans from all over the place who were both enslaved and free. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, Louisiana is a mosaic of populations that is a Tower of Babel. There were all kinds of languages being spoken. All right? So as we move into after 1803, that's when the border crosses us in Louisiana. And now we're technically, administratively American. But all these people who were there before, no matter what their skin color, and no matter what their legal status as free or enslaved, because they speak French and because they're Catholic, they call themselves Creoles. Why? Because they want to distinguish themselves from Americans. Because for them, Americans are foreigners. They're immigrants. How many times have you heard about Americans being immigrants? We never relate this word immigrants or foreigners to Americans today. There were people still in Louisiana who were first language French and Creole speakers 40 years ago who were still calling English speakers Américains. They were the other. But because now we've been assimilated into this American English-speaking mainstream, we don't have that filter for this thing anymore. And then as we move through the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War, now we're really into the early 20th century, the American period, and now this term Creole becomes more and more and more racialized. Because before the Civil War, you had all these French speakers. There's the white ones, there's the black ones, there's the free ones, there's the enslaved ones, and then the Creole white people are trying to reclaim their place in the political and the economic system, and they sort of reject what we now call the Creoles of color from this Creole label. And of course, as white people, they could not have anybody especially the Americans, imagining that they might be related to people of color, and of course they were their brothers, their sisters, their cousins, and everybody else. And so we lost that sort of fight against the Americans for control of this word. And now it's become completely racialized. And as we move through the early 20th century, when English becomes the mandatory language of public education in 1921, we become more and more racialized. And we see this sort of bifurcation of these Creole and Cajun labels in the late 60s, early 1970s. I'll get into that in just a second. But this is all related to the politics of language and how English comes to dominate and how English definitions for these spaces and who these people are and what languages they speak is going to influence everything, and influences even today our perceptions. Everybody's heard about the Acadians. I myself am a descendant of Acadians. My family's been in Louisiana since the 17 teens. They came from France to New Orleans. Later there were Acadians who came in, who were kicked out from Canada. They spent 25 years in France. They arrived in Louisiana in 1786. So when I say the things that I say, I'm not trying to erase Cajuns or Acadian influence in Louisiana, but I just want to talk to you about populations here for a second. The Acadians, over a 21-year period, were only 3,000 people who arrived into this colony in small, sort of trickly groups. The colony was already populated by, again, that whole diverse mosaic of people I showed you a few minutes ago, right? Everybody knows about Cajuns. In 1795, the number of people of African descent in Louisiana who were speaking French or Creole was 10 times greater than the total number of Acadians who arrived in Louisiana over a 21-year period. How often do you see that in a textbook that talks about French in Louisiana? You don't. How often do we hear that in classrooms? We don't. Because we have to control what the narrative is in English to maintain power of the white ruling class, right? This historic marker was put up just outside the plantation house where I do all PR marketing and all that kind of stuff. And if you read that, it was put up in 1962 by Ugula Village, so we have the Native Americans represented there. Germans, Canadians, Acadians, Spaniards. Who's missing? No. Africans. Africans are missing from this narrative, from 1962. Even though just inside the gate where this sign is, the Africans who were enslaved on that place were 200 of them versus 20 white people. Okay? How we look at this history is going to be determined by the language that we speak and how it's presented. So I tweet a lot. I wonder where I learned that. I tweet a lot. And I have these revelations, and people follow me from all over, because there are lots of academics who follow me. But I put this challenge out to high school textbook publishers. If you're going to talk about the Acadians in your French classes, in your textbooks, you also have to talk about the Africans who were there before. And today, right now, ratio to ethnic population, if we start sort of dividing people into different groups, Native Americans in Louisiana speak French at a higher rate than people who identify as Cajun or Creole. How many of you knew that? So we just had Hurricane Ida come through a month ago. So in Lower Lafourche and Lower Terrebonne parishes, which got absolutely devastated, in those places, there was not a single building that was not damaged by that storm. The most sinistrés, the most touched and affected populations are French-speaking Native Americans, who, because of their status as French speakers, are in some ways blocked by the American federal government to get federal recognition. Because in the 18th century, in the 19th centuries, their native languages, their indigenous languages were replaced by French. So, all right. So, why do we know one story and we don't know the other? Because of the language. Because of the way that language is used in our history textbooks, in our historical narratives, in our nation-building narrative to economically and politically control populations and to divide and conquer them. Right? In 1881, this woman named Laura André wrote, Louisianians, in French, she's writing in French, Louisianians understood the introduction of a foreign language would lead to the loss of their rights. And the language question is not in vain, it's a question of independence and nationality. This term nationality there is going to mean identity, right? So in 1881, here's a woman in Louisiana writing about a foreign language. And what language was that? No, English. For her, the foreign language is English.
So the rights of the English?
The Americans. Right, the Americans.
So they are the minority?
Correct.
Okay.
Now in 1916, there is the Louisiana Compulsory Education Act. So it says that every child between the age of 7 and 14 has to go to school, right? But they're not all going to go to the same schools, these children. There are schools for the white kids, there are schools for the black kids, and later, much later, there are going to be schools for the Native American kids. Among all of these populations, you have children who speak French or Creole, because ethno-racial identity and language spoken are not always synonymous. They speak these languages, but now they're all going to be segregated from their same language peers. They're split up. And then, 5 years later, well, actually, we're not there yet. And you have all this going on with Teddy Roosevelt, who says, we're not a polyglot boarding house, there's room for one language here, and that's the English language. And then, boom, we get to 1921. Now the Americans are the majority population. That means they're also the majority elected officials. They have control of the state legislature. And on June 18th of 1921, they pass a new state constitution and they make English the only language of public education. So before 1921, there were French language schools in Louisiana where subject matter in the classrooms was delivered in French, and English was taught as a foreign language, right? So math, science, grammar, all this stuff's going to be taught in French. But as of 1921, now everything's going to switch to English. What's happening here is that French is going to be relabeled and taught as a foreign language in our schools, even though it is the maternal language for many of our people. And what's going to happen now? That is going to create a relational disconnect to language, because these children are going to be then programmed in English to think of their own language and their own culture as a foreign. In Louisiana schools still today, you have to study a foreign language in school. If children are studying French, in some places, they might have grandparents or great-grandparents for whom French was their native language. So you see how all this begins to get warped. The other things that happen, this relational disconnect, there are all kinds of myths that are going to be presented, that are going to be perpetuating, that French in Louisiana is a broken language, that it's only an oral language, that it's different from standard French and incomprehensible, that all these other myths are also going to be created and projected and constantly, literally, physically beat into these children who speak a language other than English. I do want to be clear about this. There are a lot of people who imagine or who will say that this specifically targeted the people who identify as Cajun. It did not. It applied to every heritage language group, no matter what their ethno-racial identity was. Cajun, Creole, the Spanish speakers who were Isleños, the German speakers, the native language speakers, it applied to everybody. And this is also going to lead us to this thing that I said earlier, where we don't have any modern concepts of the idea of minority language or of minority language rights, which when we talk to our counterparts in Canada, in Acadians, which is the Maritimes, or in Quebec, or in the other minority language areas, this is a very difficult thing for them to understand. Like, how have all these people in Louisiana historically not come together as a language group, but what I reply to them is, your strength where you are in Acadie, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, that area, in Quebec, everybody's white, everybody's Catholic. Down here, we've got white people, black people, indigenous people who have been racially segregated. And that still remains today a huge obstacle to how we try to relaunch interest in these languages and get people to speak them. And when I was director of CODAFIL, that's the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, I'll talk about it in a minute, I was tasked with trying to start French immersion schools throughout the state. And that's when I really began to dig into this idea about, okay, if my goal is to try to present this language to people and get them to be interested in it, I first have to understand how identity and attachment to that language was deconstructed. That's the first step. To then bringing us to an idea about how we can reintroduce it and make it interesting to people to get them to buy into the idea. I cannot tell you how many times I have heard somebody say to me, French was only an oral language in Louisiana. There were L'Abeille was printed until 1925. There were French language newspapers printed in every area of South Louisiana, in every parish. They were printed in French. And so, if French were only an oral language, who was writing the articles? Who was buying the newspapers and reading them? Who was buying the ads? This is one of those myths that was created, right? And if French was only an oral language, then English was also only an oral language. Because if you look at literacy rates between Anglophones and Francophones during this time period, the Anglophones are equally illiterate. How often have you heard English called only an oral language? English was only an oral language. So this brings us back to this idea of relationship. We're English dominant. And so we can't even begin to imagine or to say something about English as being only an oral language. The words we use, foreign language, all right? In English, I learned about the Louisiana Purchase when I was in school. We bought Louisiana for $15 million. But in French, and for my ancestors who were in Louisiana in 1803, that thing wasn't called the Louisiana Purchase, it was called the Sale of Louisiana, la vente de la Louisiane. So in this one idea of the Louisiana Purchase, that's nation building, because we bought Louisiana. I was on a tour several years ago with a whole bunch of other tourism people, and it was right when the hop-on, hop-off buses had started in New Orleans, the double-decker buses, and the tour guide, we'd already had several drinks, which I hope we'll do later. The tour guide says, "Can you believe that? We bought Louisiana for $15 million. I was like, he says, "Yes, sir." I said, "No, we were sold for $15 million. And he could not wrap his head around the paradigm shift or the prism shift for understanding what this event was on both sides of the coin. To think about what a political act it would be if we started teaching our children in Louisiana in our schools that we were sold for $15 million. Because then that's a deconstruction of the American identity that's been imposed. Is this making sense to y'all?
Yes.
All right. In 1968, the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana was formed. It's a government agency. It's the only one of its kind in the United States, whose mission is the preservation or the development of heritage languages. In Louisiana, that's French. There's also a Creole component to it. And when it was sort of started, the idea was to do anything and everything for the development of the language. So it has economics, it has education, there's all kinds of stuff under there. It's a tiny, tiny little agency. When I was director, I had an annual budget starting out of $250,000. I had one full-time employee and one part-time employee, and in 2012, the governor of Louisiana, Bobby Jindal, line item vetoed my budget by $100,000. When I left in 2014, I was paying a light bill with private fundraising dollars. So since then, they've been able to get the budget back up to around $500,000. They're about 5 employees and they're doing great work, but there's only that little bitty team trying to do this giant mandate that has international relations, it has economic development, it has education pieces to it, and it's just like rowing upstream. And we'll get to the university part of this in a little bit. In 1970, the guy who founded Codeville was a politician named James Dumongeau. He was a representative in Congress, and he asks teachers for militancy in the classroom. He wants teachers to start to sort of really advocate for the French language with their students. And so there are some students who hear this, and there are also some artists who hear this. This is Zachary Richard, who's a very, very well-known Cajun musician, and he sings this. Behind him is not in Louisiana. That big crowd behind him is in New Brunswick. The first time he sang this song in Louisiana, he was booed off the stage.
When was that?
Early 1970s. He was booed off the stage, and to sing and make this kind of music, he had to go to Canada. Because this kind of call to action was contrary now in the early 1970s to what the World War II generation had lived through, this whole idea of Americanization, and he tried to heed the call, and no one would go to his concerts. He is absolutely a superstar in Canada and in Louisiana. Everybody knows who he is. Now he's kind of semi-retired. He's come back home to Louisiana, and he does some pretty incredible work, especially with the immersion schools, but this kind of idea of political action in language is not something that people in Louisiana wanted to hear. Oops. There was, in the early 1970s when Codeville got started, this is fun, there was actual angst in the legislature in Louisiana and in the American Congress that the French Renaissance in Louisiana would lead to us being another Quebec. That meant political, economic power, all of that, and they had to literally mollify the legislators in Baton Rouge and the Congress members to tell them, no, there's no real political idea behind this. We're not going to try to break away or take things over. But this is also about the very same time period, early 1970s, when we start to see this bifurcation I told you about earlier. Creole means black, Cajun means white. Because if you divide and conquer people, you can control them. In 1970, there were 1 million people in Louisiana who could speak French or Creole. They were about 1/4 or 1/3 of the entire population of the state. Now, had they been able, despite all this segregation and reprogramming, to come together as a cohesive language group, imagine the political and economic power that they might have exerted. That could not be allowed to happen. And so today, we're maybe 100,000. So in 50 years, the number has increased by 90%. And we don't even really have a way to know how many people actually speak French in Louisiana, or Creole, or whatever, because the way that the census is worded doesn't count everybody. What's the primary language in the household? So if you have 4 people in the house, one person speaks French, that person isn't counted. So language is about power and economics. A population that's literate in its own language has political and economic power. In 2010, Code of Phil was legislatively recreated. I was brought in 2011 to start to institute some of this new mandate with 2 people and $250,000, later 100. And so all these different things have happened. In 2010, there was also a French Language Services Act that was passed through the legislature, where the idea was to identify people in state government offices who could speak French. We really don't have a way to do that, because how do we measure what their capacity, their language capacity is? In 2012, this was fun. There's not an official language of Louisiana. French has a legal status, because you can write a contract in French and it has the same validity as in English, but there's no real official language in Louisiana. And every now and again, there's some Yahoo who decides that he or she wants to make English the official language of Louisiana, and at that point, everybody's like, no, we've been speaking French here since 1699. So what we did is we went sort of through the back door, and we had French inscribed in statute as the official language of the state agency. So now, if somebody tries to do another thing, we can say, oh, well, no, we already have French as an official language of the state agency, and you can't go against that. That was fun. And in 2013, we have the Immersion Choice Act. This says that the parents of 25 kids in any school district can sign a petition, and their school district has to open an immersion school. The times that has happened, there's been an ongoing legal battle in one of the parishes on the north of New Orleans for 3 years. The woman who's trying to do this is going through followed every step, done everything that she's supposed to do, and the school board continues to fight it. And the judge continues to side with the school board. Coming back to this idea of population that's literate has social, political, and economic power. I pulled this together the other day, looking at places where there are heritage or minority languages, and all these numbers for spending are really kind of fuzzy. But you'll get an idea. In Ireland with Gaelic, there are 96,000 speakers of Gaelic. The government puts $864 per speaker. A lot of it's going into media and also into job creation. In New Zealand, 50,000 speakers, they're spending $1 billion, which is about $700 million US, on initiatives for the Maori language. In Wales, you've got 5.7 million US. In Hawaii, for 24,000 speakers in Hawaii, you've got $3 million in Hawaii. In Louisiana, we've got about 100,000 speakers. Code of Phil gets about $550,000 a year from the state. That gives us $5.50 per speaker in Louisiana to do programming or to do any kinds of initiatives. So, like jazz and gumbo, these are heritage languages. These are part of our birthright, and we should start looking at this in heritage languages as opposed to foreign languages. This idea of using this term heritage language as opposed to foreign makes it more accessible. Because we study about jazz, we study about gumbo, we study about all these other cultural elements that make Louisiana such a very distinct place. Language is never part of that discussion. I want you to hear this, because these are the people who are going to be your students. These are high schoolers. There's the Louisiana Association of French Clubs. And every year they have a convention. They didn't do one last year, obviously, but this was from 2019. So I was asked to do for them a presentation similar to this. I did a political speech to them, right? And there are about 200 of them in this room. And I'm showing you this not to hear what I say, but so that you can hear their reaction.
So, like jazz and gumbo, the French and Creole languages are part of our heritage and our cultural birthright, and we need to use them as such. We talk all the time about music, about tourism, about oil and gas, and about all these different natural resources. French is a natural resource. It is an economic development tool that we have at our fingertips. We simply need to harness. And you guys, there are almost 200 of you here in this room. You know what would be just freaking amazing for me to see? Would be for you to show up, for example, at the state legislature one day, all of you with French t-shirts, speaking French, saying, we are here, we exist, on parle français. Okay?
I still get really choked up when I see that. So the future of French in Louisiana, it's not a question of preservation. I hear that all the time. Preserve French in Louisiana, preserve French in Louisiana. You preserve something, you put it in formaldehyde and stick it on the shelf and you look at it. We've got to develop it. We've got to create these social and professional and economic applications for it. And that goes for Spanish and other languages too. It's not just French I'm talking about here. So sort of if you're not French oriented, if you're Spanish oriented or Italian oriented or Russian oriented or German oriented, think about how you're going to appeal to those kids and bring them into your classroom, right? In 2018, we were finally admitted as an observer into the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. So this is the UN level grouping of the French-speaking countries in the world. It's kind of like the Commonwealth for the UK, but this is the French world. And I'm going to play this once again so you can hear the kids' reaction.
So, the consultant just spoke about this. In October of this past year, Louisiana finally became an observer member of the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. So now, when you look at a map of the French places in the world, Louisiana is finally there. So,
those are high schoolers. They're kids who are from 14 to 18 years old, excited about this. Now, coming back to this idea about these immersion schools that we have in Louisiana, so there are about 34, 35 of them scattered throughout the state. French is the primary language of delivery of course matter, so they're doing 65, 70% of the day in French. There are also some Spanish pathways in Louisiana. There are some Mandarin pathways as well. But if we look at immersion sort of as the centerpiece of this idea of rebuilding French speakers in Louisiana, these are all the different pieces around that have to be in place. And everything that's in red doesn't exist. Because you're, for the most part, university people, as we move into this next bit, and I know we're probably running out of time, I want you to look it up here at the university piece, right? Because collaboration between the French department and the education department, development of a curriculum that is Louisiana identity building, matière en français, that's coursework in language. It's not language as coursework, it's coursework in language. And that's what I need. That's what I need where I sit in this whole paradigm. Because what generally is happening for us who are on the operational side of language, you guys are on one side doing language as coursework, and we're on the other side trying to do language as social, economic and professional development, and there's this brick wall between us. Now, how do we break that down? How do we get there? Because I'm in the tourism world. In 2019, tourism economic impact on Louisiana was $18.9 billion. It's the third largest industry in the state. All right, there are all these people employed in tourism. Do you know that if you're a French tourist, or if you are a Spanish-speaking tourist, and you come to Louisiana, there is hardly any tourism product that you can consume in your language. I'll bet you that if any of you go to Europe or to South America, you're going to find services in English. All right? Now, look at this. One of our challenges to developing this is that all the decision makers are English speakers. But they sell Louisiana as this phenomenal French and Creole background kind of place. But people come and there's sort of false advertising. They get to us and they can't go to an attraction, or they can't go to a restaurant, or they can't go stay in a hotel and actually speak French. And there are expectations out there. I had a meeting with a tour operator from Copenhagen in Denmark about 2 years ago at an international trade show, and she asked me, she said, I was thinking about coming to Louisiana with my family to New Orleans, but we were afraid we wouldn't be able to get around because everybody speaks French. Which is the absolute opposite of what's the reality. Now, I submitted a chapter to a book that's coming out in a couple of weeks about the French experience in North America, and mine was all about tourism and the tourism economy. So I went through the hotel, restaurant, tourism curricula at every one of our universities in Louisiana that offers one, and in none of those curricula is there a language requirement. And it's the third largest industry in the state. So, how does this make sense? And and I know you guys are like swimming upstream all the time with budget cuts and all that kind of thing, but how do we break down some of these silos so that our languages, no matter which one they are, become relevant in the marketplace? I do PR marketing for this place, which I've been associated with this project since 1996. I've left and gone back several times. After Katrina, the big hurricane in 2005, I went and worked in state government. So I was in the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development, the Louisiana Office of Tourism. I worked for the Lieutenant Governor's Office doing international relations. Why? Je parle français. And then I worked at the French Consulate, and then I was director of Codafil, and I went back to Laura in 2014. But coming back here also brings me back to this idea about language, because this is one of 2 historic sites in Louisiana where you can get a tour in French. And we do it every day here. And French language visitation here is about 15 or 20% of the visitation annually in a regular, not COVID time period. And it's several $100,000 of direct economic impact. And I have tried for years with all of my counterparts at other historic sites and restaurants and hotels, trying to, with numbers, like actually showing them, this is what you're missing out on. And if we could build a network of French-speaking places, if we could build a network of Spanish-speaking places, see, people are just leaving all this money on the table. And so even within Laura, there's an entire ecosystem of French that goes from the website, the advertising, the signage, the people, the tours, the reactions, the merchandise, that gives us an entire French-speaking ecosystem here, which then allows us to pull those people in. So you guys in your classrooms and in your departments, you know, I see, and I took the time to go through some of the inventory of everything that was going to be talked about during the conference, and I also went and just did quick little samples of some of the websites for your departments, and in lots of cases, you see that another language gives you access to jobs and to opportunities, but where? Like, what are you guys providing to them to springboard them into that? There was nothing for me. I created all of this whole pathway by myself, basically, just identifying needs and making myself as a French speaker sort of the guy to go to do that. But like, I want to pull other people along with me, you know, because I can't do all the translation work that people send to me. I can't do all the telephone interviews or the things when there's a hurricane coming and Canada or France wants to talk to somebody on site about how we're going to all die. Like, I can't respond to all of that. And neither can all the Spanish speakers who were trained to do that kind of thing. So the next steps, you know, kind of recognize and address the social and institutional segregation of all the different groups of French speakers in Louisiana, and also changing some of the verbiage that we use to talk about it, like our relationship to language, foreign language versus heritage language, and all that kind of thing. Coursework in target language and not coursework in or about language. And how to bring speakers together for a real political project that addresses sort of this social and professional and economic development opportunities that are in language. Funding, Jesus Christ, that's always an issue. And coming back to this idea about who controls the language controls everything. Society, the economy, and all of that. So, if there's one thing that I would just beg you to do, try to think about some of this, because we have need especially in the tourism sector, but in other sectors as well. I saw somebody did a presentation, I think, on the different lexicons from the different Spanish speaking places for the medical field. Like, that's phenomenal. That is absolutely phenomenal. And I can guarantee you that down in South Louisiana right now, where you've got elderly Native people, elderly Native Americans who don't speak English very well, that there are French speakers down there working with. Some of us are down there working with them. This is some of the stuff that's actually happening. And these people are a generation, for the most part, they're a generation younger than I am. You've got publications. I invite you to, if you have Amazon Prime, go and watch this documentary, Finding Cajun. Because I think that it will enlighten you about some of these debates that really center on the identity labels Cajun and Creole. There's an online newspaper, there's some collection of poetry. Today Louisiana is producing some great little videos online. Like, there's all kinds of stuff happening. But we're trying to figure out how to get it out there so people know that it's actually, French wasn't just an oral language in Louisiana. Today, it's a language of creation, it's a language of dynamism, it's a language of young people, and it's a language of economy. And I'll close with this. The French language in Louisiana is probably the most green and most renewable resources, that is also the most undeveloped and the most underused. So with that, I will kind of close out. I get really excited about this subject, and I work with a lot of academics about these very, very same things. And I'll tell you, remember we watched the video with all of the kids who were really, really excited about French. One of my very good friends who started out in tourism but who's now a teacher in one of the high schools that brings the kids from the immersion and actually keeps them sort of in an immersion environment in high school, is having real difficulty. And she's really afraid that her students, when they get to university, are going to abandon French. Because there's not anything for it, because they've done all of their subject matter in French. When they get to university, there's nothing for them. They can't study communications, or marketing, or science, or medicine, or business. And if you guys could think a little bit about how you tweak some of your coursework to address some of those things, you have young people who are interested in language. How to bring them into your classrooms is something that I think about every day. I think about every day, and I'm sure you do too, because it's a commodity. And I hate to put it that way, but you're selling a product, and your product has to be consumable by people who want to buy it. And people are, they're pulling all kinds of different directions. So I'll close out now because I've probably gone way beyond the time limit, but I could talk about this stuff obviously for hours and hours and hours. But it's been an absolute delight to be here with you, and I hope that some of the things that I said resonated for you a little bit, and I would be delighted to chat with you later or be in touch about some of my ideas and things like that. So thank you very, very much for having me.
We always open the floor for questions.
Sure.
Anyone has-
Yes, ma'am.
So you said that the power structure in Louisiana, for so many different areas, is white people in charge, and they have this thing against French. Obviously, it's not their heritage there. So is there any kind of economic base that would enable some of my French majors to go to Louisiana and be employed?
That's the challenge, because we don't have. I look a lot at Canadian models for minority languages and the ideas of discrimination positive. How do you say that in English? It's like there's kind of affirmative action. Thank you. So there's no affirmative action for language in Louisiana. So there's no economic incentive for a company, for example, to hire a French speaker or a Spanish speaker. There are no jobs that are actually posted that are specifically recruiting them either. Coming back to the idea of the power structure, interestingly enough, a lot of these people, especially in the tourism sector, are descendants of French and Creole speaking Louisianans, but they're assimilated. So again, we're dealing with this whole disconnect, this relational disconnect that they have with the language. So.
Yeah, and we tell our foreign language students that if they study a foreign language, they'll have an edge when they go out to seek employment, an edge on the job market. And that's like falsehood, like it's correct, but only up to a certain point. Because the only university college that requires foreign language past 6 hours, so in 6 hours we're going to learn bonjour, au revoir.
Right.
So the only college that requires more than 6 hours since last year is the College of Business. And yet there's a disconnect between College of Business and College of Liberal Arts. So it's like I feel your pain because
Well, I mean, we have that very same problem in Louisiana with the immersion schools, right? It's only in the last 2 years that one of our universities has put together a Master of Arts in Teaching program to actually train people to teach in target language. And just again to sort of make that difference, teaching language as subject matter and teaching subject matter in language are very different animals. So they have to be able, especially if they're certified, so K-8, they have to be able to teach all subject matter in language, math, science, social studies, all and English language arts for the most part. But it's only in the last 2 years that we have one of those. So we're still heavily dependent. Probably in our immersion schools, I would say 85 or 90% of our French teachers are foreign nationals who are brought through these very intricate agreements that we have with the French government and also with the French-speaking government of Belgium. So we're heavily dependent on that. And if for whatever reason France decided tomorrow that they're not going to renew this agreement, which is usually it's a 4-year thing, the system collapses because we don't have in our and the university in Louisiana, our language departments and our education departments, complete and total silos.
yeah, even though we're supposed to, encourage our students to seek O-level certification. And
Right.
yet, it's kind of like we're working on our side and education is silent, that college is silent.
Right. Yeah, it's frustrating. Well, even for me, because I'm looking at the HRT programs, with the restaurant tourism programs, and it doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make educational sense. It doesn't make society building sense. So, anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
University, but long we might look at is at Texas Tech in the School of Communications. We have a program in Hispanic media. And that
Yes,
covers
yes.
Print, radio, TV, etc. And the funding has been pretty good. One thing that's helped a lot is we're been designated a Spanish language serving institute. So, but that, that's been helpful.
The last offer to buy Univision was $16 billion. There's economic and consumer power behind the Spanish language. So she was just saying, for those of you who might not have been able to hear, and I forget which university you said I couldn't hear. You're Texas Tech. They have a media communications in Spanish, which is phenomenal.
Again, it's because we have the market.
Correct.
It's economically, we have Chilean Spanish-speaking radio stations, TV stations,
Yeah.
etc. And you have to train people for those jobs.
Exactly.
So, I think you're hitting on the right thing. You have to convince whatever language, level, whether university administrators, legislation, whatever, of the economic. I think the economic.
It's all about the economics. It's all about the economics. Yes.
I have a question about the language programs in, I have a question about the language programs
Mhm.
in, the French language program that is taught in Louisiana. Is it more oriented towards Louisiana French, or is it more l'Académie Française type of French?
The teachers so no matter what space that you were in, the language of delivery of education is always standard register, always. And so our teachers in our immersion schools are literally from all over the place. They're from France, they're from Belgium, they're from Congo, they're from Mali, Haiti, Quebec, Acadians, Louisiana. And so through the course of their elementary and college, junior high, they're hearing all of these different varieties of French, but the core curriculum is always going to be taught in standard international register. There are supplemental pieces that have been developed over the years that address Louisiana French as supplemental pieces, but you can't deliver algebra in vernacular language, right? Well, because there's nothing developed to do it.
Well, I think then that's where we should start.
I am 100%. So coming back to this idea of identity building, right?
Exactly.
And I throw this at the. Where are you from?
I'm from France.
Okay, me. Where do you teach?
I'm sorry, I teach Austin.
Okay, so we don't have the identity building piece. So imagine in a Louisiana immersion school that you have a Hispanic child or an Asian child, right, who is in a French immersion pathway. The teacher is from Mali. The curriculum is American. It's been translated into French by the lady from Mali that is now being delivered to the kid who's Asian or Hispanic or with no Louisiana, even a Louisiana kid. All the Louisiana kids that go to those schools are completely 100% assimilated Americans. None of them are speaking French at all. None of them. The families have been assimilated for 1 or 2 generations at least, right? And so how do you build French language identity for that kid with all those different disparate things? And this is something that I have thrown at my friends and colleagues in the Louisiana universities and the French departments. We have every element that we need to build a curriculum that is Louisianisant, that would Louisianize the school children, But it takes funding and it takes will. It takes academic university will. And I say this as an observation and not as a critique, but our universities are completely divorced from any kind of research or any kind of implication in this whole process. There are audio and video recordings that have been done in Louisiana of French speakers and Creole speakers since the invention of the phonograph. And there is an entire corpus of literature, of historic documents. There's everything that you need to build a curriculum that would sort of build this Louisiana French-speaking identity, but it's not assembled. And then the second thing that you have to do with that is also policy, is how do you take that, so once you've developed it, how do you then get the state school board to adopt it and then push it out into the school system? And that's a whole other, okay, coming back to this, okay. You can read all about Acadians in our social studies books and in the French books. There's no mention of Native Americans. There's no mention of Africans as this kaleidoscope and as this mosaic of people, because the people who were creating that stuff don't know all of this. Like, so there's all these different disconnects that, like, yo, I see it so perfectly lined up, like this astrology chart that, or astronomy that sort of all hooks everything together. I'm just a sales and marketing dude, right? So I don't have the power. But yeah, did I answer your question?
You did.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I have another question.
Sure.
You said that you tweet a lot.
Say that again?
You tweet a lot.
I do.
And also we're talking about how powerful language can be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm asking what the most impact you've had, whether you wrote in or you tweeted in French or in
Most of the
English.
people who follow me are French speakers.
Okay.
Twitter is one of those spaces that I try to keep in French because I will tell you, I've struggled to do this presentation in English. Because all of this stuff is in my head in French because I usually do it for French-speaking audiences. I do this for the new teachers when they come in from abroad to sort of give them an overview of the diversity. I talk about this a lot with journalists and researchers who come in and like, let's talk about Cajuns. I'm like, no, let's talk about diversity. So there's this constant sort of repositioning of the narrative that I always have to do before I can even begin to discuss some of these things with researchers. I got contacted a couple of weeks ago by a PhD student who wanted to look at Louisiana. She's like, okay, so what can I do to sort of document preservation? Like, preservation's done. There's a dictionary, there's all kind of stuff. Now we need to talk about development. I said, but what hasn't been done, there are lots of aspects of this that haven't been documented from an academic perspective. Language attrition, for example. Because there are researchers or journalists who will come to Louisiana today and they'll interview an elderly person who was a first language French speaker, but who's been English dominant since first grade. So all of the linguistic ecosystem or context for that person have been replaced by English, right? So churches, English, grocery stores, English, doctors, English, and all of that situational vocabulary that you would get in context, that you just sort of absorb and acquire, doesn't exist anymore. So then what they'll say is, their observation will be, well, Louisiana French is substandard, Louisiana French. Well, no, because if you go back and look at a recording or a video of someone, I was talking to Keegan a little while ago, there's a video clip from a Canadian journalist, a Québécoise, who was in Louisiana in 1970, and she interviewed an elderly man in his garden, like in his vegetable garden, and except for his accent, which is absolutely Louisiana, every gender, every accord, everything is perfectly French. It's perfectly French. And you'll read things online or even hear people say, in Louisiana, we sort of always conjugated être verb with avoir. No. This old man, who was probably 80 in 1970, says, après être sorti de l'école. Everything I've heard about Louisiana French has told me that he shouldn't say that. So, you know, one of the things that on my Twitter thing is like démythificateur, so mythbuster. Because I'm always looking at these things that contradict what the canon says. And they're all there. And it's just hard to get people to look at them. Okay, all of you probably remember when they said that Pluto wasn't a planet. Right? That was kind of disconcerting. Because we had all learned that Pluto was a planet, and suddenly now it wasn't. So when you take stuff to people and you say, okay, so this is a historic recording that contradicts what you say. This is a historic document in French. It contradicts what we've been told and what we've always believed. That's destabilizing for people. Because now we're talking about disassimilation, which is a whole other presentation. Ça fait du sens?
Oui.
D'accord. On pourra en discuter après si tu veux.
Ah oui, s'il vous plaît.
Ah ouais, je t'en prie. Avec plaisir. Avec plaisir. Parce que pour moi, tout cela, en français, c'est beaucoup plus clair. Voilà. All right. Anything else? Is it drink time?
Quick question.
Yes, yes, please.
Question about the Code of Field.
Mm-hmm.
So the Code of Field came in the 60s.
68.
68. And then it phased out for a while because you said it had been restructured again.
Well, it kind of lost political footing. Okay? Because if you think about what I said, in 1970, we had a million people, right? And then over time, all those people died. All those people that were the early supporters of this whole French Renaissance thing, dead. And now, so you get into their kids, their grandkids, who are all now assimilated, they're all English dominant, they're all glad to be American. And so French is something that, you know, was sort of the secret language of the grandparents or whatever. And there's no economic or social benefit to speaking French, so kind of what's the point? So, you know, and so the focus of the French education piece shifted from French as a second language to immersion in the early mid-90s. So that's now the real focus is immersion. But here again, we have this. There's 5,000 kids in immersion schools right now. What happens to them after they get out of high school? Where do they go? They just kind of disappear. So that's another thesis topic for somebody if they want to study like what happens to immersion kids after immersion. So
Thank you.
I hope that made sense for you all. It makes perfect sense to me. Sometimes I don't communicate.